At this point, you know Lacan well enough to sense that it's the former translation of nia that he's going to pursue. And in pursuing to formulate exactly as he's been doing for a while now in 1972, namely with a bunch of backwards and upside down letters. And that's what we're edging towards here. If you want it mapped out for you in a summative way, you can get out pen and paper and write your nia, NYA, NIA. Underneath the NYA, you can write the first formula of feminine enjoyment. There does not exist someone who denies the phallic function. And under the second nia, NIA, you can write the masculine counterpart that says there does exist someone who negates the phallic function. The first nia is feminine, the second nia is masculine. And in many ways, the first is a response to the second. Men stand up and cry that there is someone who negates the phallic function, nia. Women respond by saying, hold up, motherfucker, there is no such thing as someone who negates the phallic function, NYA. Now, up to this point, Lacan's attention has been mostly on the masculine side of things, you've heard me say, notably on that NIA, the nia that here stands in for his first formula of masculinity, reading there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negate the phallic function. We've discussed this formula at length in our previous series, and I don't have time to rehearse everything here. I got a dog that needs to be walked. So I'll be brief, or at least I'm going to try and be brief. You know how these things go. In that spirit, here you have it. The structure of masculinity is mathematical and well captured in set theoretical terms. And don't let your eyes glaze over yet because I used the M word, math. Here's how it works. Close your eyes and think through this with me. In order for all men to be subsumed under the phallic function, thereby constituting a complete and total set or category of masculine subjects, there has to be one man who is not subsumed with them, an excluded, exceptional, real man whose limitless, uncastrated enjoyment defies the phallic function, by which every other man remains contained, controlled, and limited. Now that might be a bit much, but it does add some captions to what Lacan is up to here. So you can pause at this point and go back and re-listen to that. I'll restate it again here in a minute. But this logic of the all and the none, the no one, even better, is working here. Here's what I mean. Relative to all men, this exceptional real man is not. His identity, or more precisely his inexistence, we'll come to that in a minute, is that of no man, a no man. And you know where I'm going with this. Right back to the mythical motherfucker, and that's exactly what he is, that we've been discussing since Seminar 17, following Lacan's lead. Right back, in other words, to the myth of the father of the primal horde who prohibits all his sons from sleeping with the mommies. You see now the social theory I was cooking up a few minutes ago, leading up to castration and the phallic function. Here is the social field in which certain behaviors are promoted and others are prohibited. That's part of what this symbolizes. The myth of the father of the primal horde is one of prohibition. Here, a certain behavior is being prohibited to the sons. Don't sleep with the mommies. And that's why I refer to Daddy in this moment as a mythical motherfucker. We'll come to the mythical part in a minute, but know that he is the motherfucker, the only one who gets to sleep with the mommies. We've been over all this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Just to note this. We are talking about prohibition. And the prohibition in question here, from the no of the father, is one that the sons, this is the key part, subsequently affirm by and for themselves, transforming the father's "you must not sleep with the mommies" into their own "we will not sleep with the mommies." Again, referring back to my homie Kenneth Burke, his "you must" becomes their "we will." Thereby, in this moment, taking on his no as their name. This is a good way to understand the no of the father and the name of the father. The no of the father is this mythical act of prohibition. The name of the father is its affirmation, its beya'un, by the sons, who accept it as their name. In a word, their brotherhood, these sons united, it consists in their collective affirmation of a limit imposed on their enjoyment by a classic big other's prohibition. And I'm fucking around with the image of a big other here because I want you to have in mind the social field of constraint that yields castration, limitation, and ultimately the phallic function, which is a pursuit of wholeness for oneself in the midst of constraint, limitation, lack, and the like. But I also want you to have this queued up in the sense of brotherhood. There's a brotherhood and a sisterhood that consists in the collective affirmation of what some avatar of the big other in the myth of the father of the primal horde does when they prohibit certain behaviors. There's a limit imposed on the addressees of that prohibition. And the process known as castration culminates in a collective affirmation of that limit. You will not sleep with the mommies, followed by we will not sleep with the mommies. But don't take my word for it. Page 9 of our text, of our version of Létourdi, is excellent on this point, as clear, coherent, and accessible as we need it to be. It's on the topic of the universal that we see Lacan edging in the direction of this insight that he's been scaling up for the past few years. This is exactly what he's doing when he cues up the universal. It's throughout the first half of Létourdi. I haven't read the second half, so maybe it's there as well. But in the first half, the universal keeps popping. And this is the reason why it keeps popping. Page 9 gives us one among many passages to consider, but it's a good one. And here's how it works. Every universal is contained and controlled. Limited works really well here by what Lacan calls an existence which denies it. Here's that emphasis on the nie, to deny. Here's that nia again. Every universal, he says, is contained and controlled. Again, the proper word here is limited by what Lacan calls an existence which denies it. That is the logic that Lacan assigns mathematically via set theory to the masculine side of things. And when he says universal, he's thinking in Latin, just like he's been for years, and just as we've said numerous times in lectures on Lacan. He's thinking of the Latin uni, meaning one, plus the Latin verb vertere, meaning to turn. And maybe even of the Latin universum, which is all turned into one, and thus whole. inclusive, total. You got ears to hear? What we're talking about is the second formula of masculinity. The one that looks like a backwards capital upside down AX next to the capital phi X. The one that reads, all masculine enjoyment is determined by the phallic function. This formula is the formula for a universal, all-inclusive set comprised of each and every masculinized subject. Here is the universal primarily in question here. It's a universal, all men, that is contained, controlled, and limited by the masculine wager on the existence of someone who denies all this shit. All men are subordinate to the phallic function, this second masculine formula reads. Oh, hey-oh, except one, or so the story goes. What is the existential status of this one? This someone, this exceptional one that establishes the universal set of all men, containing and controlling by imposing a limit on the sons thereby. Let's just ask the question again. I've been saying it for a while now, the question as well as its answer. The existence of this exceptional real man is in fact an inexistence, for reasons that we'll recall in a moment. It's the presumed speech and action of this inexistent real man that catches our eye on page 9, I would wager. Denial here again spelled exactly as you would expect, N-I-E, Nia. And note, even though it ain't the N-I-A, this is still the Nia that we've been talking about from the verb for to deny. It's right there, apparent for us, and thereby linked to the structure of masculinity. So here it is. One more time. In order for all masculine enjoyments to be defined by the phallic function, there must be someone, somewhere, somehow, who denies nia, this constraint, and in so doing fixes its limit, as Lacan puts it in L'Étourdi. There you have the two formulas of masculinity together. Let me be really clear about how they hang. The first formula of masculinity that reads, there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function, it is the limit condition of the second that says all masculine enjoyments are subordinate to the phallic function. The first is the limit condition of the second. I don't use that term lightly, so let's slow down a second. What the fuck is a limit condition? A limit condition is a set of criteria or constraints within which a particular system or operation can function. But check it out. A limit condition also specifies the maximum or minimum states that a system or operation can tolerate before it fails. Limit condition. So, you see them all over the place. Structural engineering, well known for limit conditions, some of which have recently been in the news. It's about the maximum load a bridge can carry, for instance. Thermodynamics has its own sense of limit conditions. A limit condition in thermodynamics might be the maximum temperature that a material can withstand before it decomposes, changes states, whatever. Software development. Y'all love the apps, I love the apps. Well, let's just notice a limit condition there. Here you might have the maximum number of concurrent users that an app can handle before its performance degrades. And sometimes this is exactly what you fucking see. You could also think of cellular networks getting completely overwhelmed when a huge music festival comes to town. These are limit conditions. Here, the system in question is masculinity. And you know I'm really not sorry, because masculinity is fundamentally a symptom. In fact, I would wager at this point that if you push the system of masculinity as far as Lacan already here, prior to Seminar 20, has allowed us to go, I think what you would find is that masculinity is in fact a symptom commanded by an unconscious truth that says, in fact, we are all feminine subjects. That's the difference between masculine and feminine subjects. The masculine subject is the one who denies they're feminine. We'll come to that as near as we can, as soon as we can. But for now, limit conditions, the system in question here, in all its symptomatology, is masculinity. And the operation in question is phallic enjoyment by way of the phallic function. These are the limit conditions that we're aiming toward. Daddy is presumed to have the phallus, and the sons are presumed to be nothing without its pursuit, an endeavor that paradoxically only proceeds by failure. Don't forget, the phallus is fundamentally about failure. It always comes up short. So when we talk about limit conditions, it's important to think not just about the criteria or constraints which allow a particular system to operate. Here what we're saying is, in order for all men to be a system that operates, it has to be constrained or limited by a certain figure, here of no man. Though when we look at this very carefully, what we have is a question of the phallus, a question of phallic enjoyment. And the way that the limit, the conditions that all operate together is like this. You have this figure of a no man, a real man, a daddy who's presumed to have the very thing that the sons are expected to pursue, and that without which they don't amount to shit. And this is an endeavor, though, that is destined to fail, cooked right into our notion of the phallic. The phallic field is a field that disappoints. Now, what about this daddy that is the limit condition for all the sons? Insofar as he denies the phallic function, he must remain cut off, cut out, excised from the universal set of all men. But be very careful here, my friends. As we're going to see, all of this talk of excision, from the Latin excimere, meaning to cut out, it threatens to miss Lacan's point. The masculine fantasy of a real man who is cut out from all men, let me try and correct this. It is in fact something that is cut into this structure, not cut out from it. It is excised, if you like, part and parcel of what it means to be a man. A great word for this is inscription. The first formula of masculinity that says there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function is inscribed in the second, in the category of all men, whose speech, action, and enjoyment doesn't negate the phallic function, but serves it instead. Let me try and put this a little differently, at the risk of putting it a bit too archly. Here's what we might say. The fantasy of an exceptional man, cut off and thus free from all the bullshit of social life, with all of its prohibitions and promotions, constraints, and the like. This fantasy never stops cutting in on masculine enjoyment, ever reminding all men that they are cut off from autonomy. Again, the word we have here is limited. Now, you may be wondering what's new in all of this, because you've heard all of this before. What's new is Lacan toying with this notion of cutting into, cutting out. I like the cutting into bit. That speaks more readily to what it means for the Father to exist relative to all the sons. Notice how Lacan starts working in this direction. I think this is what he's up to with all of his numerous Tom references, Thomme in the French. All of these Tom references, and I have to say it that way for reasons that will become clear in a moment, in the first half of L'Étourdi. You can track them down. They really start popping around page 34 of the version of the text with which we're working. Tom, spelled Thomme. It has multiple meanings here, but I like it just as it sounds. Tom, as in the tomcat chased the mouse, and as you watched him pass, you noticed his balls dangling behind him. Balls because he's uncastrated. That's the nature of the tomcat. Your house cat is castrated. A tomcat ain't. I also like this Tom business as a portmanteau of sorts, of two French words, meaning your and man. Tom, T-O-N, and homme, H-O-M-M-E, the French word for man. T-O-N plus H-O-M-M-E. Sorry, it's tough. It's easier to see this on the page than it is to hear it. But what it translates as, if you mash these two words up, is your man. Tom, T-O-N plus H-O-M-M-E. Tom is your man. Whose man? It's fucking my man. My man Tom. All men's man, if you want to be precise with this. He's a real man's man, this Tom. Why? Because like a tomcat, he's uncastrated. Got to hit that nail on the head a few more times here. The man that all men have trouble deciding, at least in fantasy, whether to fuck or become, that's your man, Tom. Make no mistake, the field and function of masculinity, regardless of whether or not you have a penis, in this field, Tommage, Thommage, Tommage, as Lacan dubs it, is the name of the game when it comes to masculinity. Or more precisely, and again, I think it's good to be as precise as possible here, Tommage is the rule by which all men must play this game. Which is what I think Lacan means when he says on page 36 of our text that Tommage is for all. It's a very odd French expression, but that's kind of what he's saying here, is that this tommage, this constant paying of homage to this man who's uncastrated that we fantasize about, this tomcat amongst us, who doesn't exist, by the way, it's for all men. But I, of course, for my money, as you know, prefer to talk about camping. That's right. I got to hit you one more time with the camping image. If everything is packed for the trip, that means nothing has been left behind. We're still working with this logic. Nothing has been left out. It has to be left out in order for any set to contain everything. If everything has been packed for the trip, turn the car around, because nothing has been left behind. This is the logic of masculinity. When I say it's mathematical, when I say it's set theoretical, this is what it amounts to. Packing for a fucking camping trip. Hence, again, Lacan's two formulas for masculine enjoyment. In order for all men to enjoy according to the phallic function, ever in search of wholeness qua autonomy, they must believe at some level, read in fantasy, that it's possible to reach some hyper-masculine state of self-sufficiency in which social constraint, castrative logic, and the phallic function are all overcome. And notice all the modalities at work here. I told you Lacan cues up the universal in order to discuss the denial that limits, contains, and controls this universal, all universals, in order to tell us something about masculinity. But note, when Lacan first introduces the universal at the start of L'Étourdi, he goes on to say, hey, but hold up. It's actually a modal question that we're talking about here. The universal is a modal question. Now, I'm not convinced at this point, especially after reading Seminar 19b or worse, that Lacan has his hands on the Aristotelian philosophy of modality. I know he wants to overcome it desperately, but I'm not sure he actually understands how the modes work. At least I haven't seen it yet. I know it's going to come up in Seminar 20, so maybe I'll be convinced then. At this point, I'm not. However, it is true that there are modal logics at work here, and you just heard them in how I defined the two formulas again. Necessity and possibility, they are popping there. In order for all men to enjoy according to the phallic function, ever in search of wholeness qua autonomy, they have to necessarily believe at some level that it's possible, there's another modal, to reach this hypermasculine state of self-sufficiency. Necessity and possibility are crucial to the masculine fantasy of a real man. What I would add, as you know, is impossibility, in league with that first Nia. That shit ain't, I almost said real. It don't exist. Never has it, never will it, and it certain as fuck isn't. There is no one who actually has arrived at self-sufficiency in this hyper-masculine sense. And what I would add, if we just want to move down the modal path further, is that when we shift to femininity, when we get to the feminine side of things, the modes that pop up there are contingency and potentiality. So Lacan is not wrong when he says the universal is in fact a modal question. And you can see it popping very clear on the side of masculinity. You'll also see it on the feminine side, as we've established. But I'm not sure his assignment of the modalities quite lines up with his formulas of sexuation. Not yet. But nevertheless, it is there, and so I want to call your attention to it, just so you can keep it on your radar. The part of this that I think matters for us is not the modal bit. I don't think you need it at this stage to make sense of what Lacan is doing. You can work into some nuances by way of that. What we have and what we want to focus on is this notion of autonomy, this vision of self-sufficiency that some hyper-masculine real man is supposed to maintain. Here's the dilemma about all this. You heard me state it earlier. Here it is again. The problem with all of this fetishization of autonomy, and this is just one among many of its problems, is that in order for men to pursue it, they do so by relying on others. The fantasy of a real man whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function can only be sustained by men relying on others. The fantasy of autonomy presupposes the reality of heteronomy. What does this mean for men in relationships? And remember, I'm not talking about what's behind your swimsuit zone. I'm talking about masculine subjects. You can have a vulva and be a masculine subject. Here's what it means. Here's how it plays out, relationally speaking. Only by reducing one's partners to their parts can masculine subjects feel whole. That's what this shit amounts to. That's what the phallic function amounts to on the side of masculinity. The masculine subject is the one who repeatedly, almost without fail, reduces their partner to a part. And it's a part that allows them, the masculine subject, to feel whole. Again, let's try and be categorical here, maybe even at the risk of an axiom. The fact of heteronomy is the repressed precondition for masculine fantasies of autonomy. And don't forget, in the midst of all this, because these fantasies are primarily focused on figures of hypermasculinity, real men, past and present, they are essentially homoerotic, even and especially when ostensibly straight men purport to enjoy women at the level of their parts. The masculine fantasy of autonomy that papers over the fact of heteronomy is homoerotic. And I spell homo with 2 M's, just like Lacan. Notice how he puts this in Lettre D. It's on page 54 of our version. We might say, and I think we should say following Lacan, that these fantasies that prop up masculine identity, they are homosexuated. Again, adding an extra M to the Greek prefix homo, meaning same, to remind us that it's men spelled with 2 M's that Lacan means to designate here when he says that it is a homosexuated structure. Why? You want it in a nutshell? It's because the masculine fantasy that men carry into their partnerships, their relationships, their sexual encounters with others is always a fantasy of another man, a real man, a bigger, longer, harder, more enjoying man. You see? Just take a look at POV porn. Take a look at most straight porn. Very rarely does it occur without a penis being involved. And Lacan's wager here is that part and parcel of the masculine subject is a fantasy that is structured and oriented towards other men, not women. In fact, the straighter you are, the more we start seeing homosexuated fantasies. Which doesn't mean you're gay. Hear me now. It means that the structure of masculinity that sends men so toxically, so often in the direction of feminized bodies is one that moves or is moved by a vision of hypermasculinity, where the dicks are bigger than yours, where they stay harder longer than yours, where they come more than yours, where they enjoy more than yours. And Lacan's point is, damn, that's a lot of time spent thinking about other dicks. Now that's a little crass, but it captures what he's up to when he adds that extra M to his claim that masculine fantasy is homosexuated. I would add, even to go further, that masculine fantasies are Thommosexuated, Thommo, sexuated, because they're ultimately fantasies of an uncastrated man, a man who lives fuller, freer, and less constrained, who enjoys more abundantly than all the sons. Do you see? It's really not more than that. But I do like this addition of masculine fantasies being Thommosexual. I imagine at this point, you've probably heard enough of Lacan's damned formulas of masculinity and their set theoretical articulation as I've been working it from camping trips forward. You know, you might as well just draw this thing, and it'll give you just as clean a sense as what's going on here. You could draw masculine subjectivity with 3 concentric circles, one right inside the other. Just note that if you draw it this way, it's going to mark, I believe, a significant and smart revision to the diagram work we did in our last series, where you saw the exceptional man, the formula for this one whose speech, action, and enjoyment says no to the phallic function, outside the circle of phallic enjoyment. Here, I'm putting that motherfucker right in the middle. So if you wanted to draw this, and I'll draw it with you for purposes of clarity, draw one big circle and label it phallic function. You could even use, in a fancy way to impress your friends, the capital Phi with an X next to it. Here you have it. I hold it up. It's a single circle, and I label it phallic function. Everything that occurs within this circle is going to be subordinate to the phallic function. And what I'm going to draw inside this circle is another one. And this is going to be a circle that represents all men. And so in that circle, I'm going to write the formula that says all masculine enjoyment is subordinate to the phallic function. And I hold the diagram up. I'm using red to indicate this. Blue is the phallic function, the outer circle. Inside it, there's a red circle that includes all men. Here is Lacan's second formula of masculinity that says all men are subordinate to the phallic function. Which brings us to the third circle. Now this one's tricky, and I don't quite know how else to do it except like this. I'm going to use a black marker for this one, because this is every bit a black hole at the center of masculinity. And in this black hole, I'm going to write Lacan's first formula for masculine subjectivity, the one that says there exists someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function. I hold up the diagram for you. At the center, you have a black circle with Lacan's first formula of masculine subjectivity in it that says, here is where we find someone whose speech, action, and enjoyment negates the phallic function. But to clarify what I'm talking about here, as an inexistent figure who does not exist, I'm going to shade it out so that it truly starts to look like a hole in masculinity. Not a position to be filled, but a hole that's every bit bottomless in masculinity. Masculinity has a hole in it. It's structured around an impossibility. An impossibility that, in this case, exists within the field of masculinity. That's where I put the uncut daddy. And the field of masculinity, the middle circle, is completely encompassed by the outer circle of phallic enjoyment. You can draw this, you can check it out, you can think it through on your own. I cue it up just to give us a breath of diagrammatic air in the midst of all this set theoretical formulation. The point I want to make is this transition from placing the uncut daddy and the formula thereof outside the phallic function to repositioning it as a whole in the phallic function, because it's also a whole in the phallic function, not just in the field of masculinity. The diagram that I'm holding up for you, that black circle in the middle, that's also a whole in the phallic function. The reason why I'm doing this is to emphasize that instead of existing the phallic function, and with it the category of all men, the fantasy figure of the real man now marks an extimate limit within both sets. You see where I'm going with this? This is a fucking empty set, if ever there was one. The uncut daddy is the figure of an empty set in the field of masculinity, in the field of phallic enjoyment. The operational logic of which is not existence, but instead in existence, exactly as we've worked it up in our last series. Real men are not, in fact, real. Think about it. Instead, they are among the names of a certain real that wanders errantly through the symbolic field of masculinity. That is what we are working up here. The real is a figure of existence relative to the symbolic. It is always out of place, outside the symbolic. Its names, however, names of the real, at the level of the symptom, at the level of the matheme, these two predominant names of the real that we've been working with since our series on Seminar 18. At the level of the name, however, the real exists there in the symbolic. The real itself, just as you saw in our drawing of the diagram of the analyst, it exists the field of the symbolic. But the name of the real, and that's all Daddy is, a name of the real, inexists, because it's part and parcel of the symbolic. It's a point in the symbolic where the impossible real is named. You can talk about that shit, even though it ain't ever gonna show up in that way. Now, this is technical, conceptual stuff, to be sure. But it's also stuff you already well know if you've tuned in to our recent series. So I'm just going to leave it at this. Again, risking an axiomatic statement and thus becoming a wise old fool. Daddy is a signifier in the mouths and the myths of men, and nothing more.